Number 1. Pizza. I think a lot of people can relate to this. I went to college immediately out of high school. I had absolutely no friends there. I hung out with a group of people who weren't interested in going to college. They were punks and burnouts and such. I was the academic type, but I got along with them because of my morbid interests. I was not really goth because there really wasn't a goth scene at the time. I tended to wear all black and acted like I was mourning someone, though. I went to a huge state college. As a freshman, I was supposed to have a roommate in my dorm room, but he had a freak out on the very first day. He never even moved into my room. At least with a roommate, I would have had someone who I would have around all the time, that would have become familiar. But I didn't have a roommate because no one else was looking for one. It was overwhelming. So college was scary to me. I went to all my classes but had trouble making friends there. I was too nervous and socially anxious to join a club. I often laid in bed in my dorm room, listening to others socializing. I had no real sense of comfort, and everything was overwhelming. It was a pretty big university in a big college town, so I started using the internet to maybe find someone to hang out with. I started talking to a guy in town named Scott, and found him to be pretty interesting. He was a pizza delivery driver, and college age, but he didn't attend the university. He did, however, deliver a lot of pizza on campus, and therefore knew a whole lot more about the campus than I did. And it was the familiarity with the campus, the town, and everything in the area that made me more interested in having him as my friend. So I began having a much easier time in school after that. We first met in person when he had an extra pizza and asked me if I wanted it. Apparently it was a prank pizza call and he wanted to know if I was interested. So that being done, we began getting along well, and then hanging out more in person. Anyway, we started hanging out a bit and it was pretty fun. I guess the reason he didn't go to college is because he grew up in a college town. He had seen enough of it or something. He got to go to parties and live a whole lot of the college experience, even though he never went. There was one night when we were hanging out and he got called into work. One of the other drivers was not able to make their shift. We were over at his house and he needed the money, so he had to take the shift. I told him it was okay and I would just head back over to my dorm room. But he suggested that we hang out for a bit longer, and I go with him while he made his deliveries. I knew it was a very odd thing to ask, and that's probably why I decided to go along with it. I figured it would make his day go by faster too, if he had someone to talk to while delivering pizza. It was a pretty interesting night in the beginning. We listened to some music, talked a whole lot, and then he even let me deliver a pizza or two because I wanted to try it. Late in the night, it must have been around midnight, he had a delivery for a pizza that was far out of town. The campus was huge, but the town and the campus were surrounded by nothing but farmland, so it was a short drive before you felt like you were actually out in the middle of nowhere. We drove for a while. I began wondering about why we were doing that. I mean, I'd never been a pizza delivery driver before. However, I didn't know that they didn't just deliver everywhere. And it was hard to imagine that they would deliver this far out of a college town. But I figured possibly they did that for special customers or something. I don't know. When we finally got to the house we were delivering to, I began to get even more apprehensive. It was a creepy-looking run-down place, and it was very dark. I was hoping that it wouldn't be the house we were going to, just because it was so creepy-looking. But sure enough, Scott pulled into the place. It had a long driveway, and there were no lights on the porch. "Everything all right?" Scott asked me as he stopped the car. "You look a little tense and kind of got quiet there." I explained I was fine. I just thought the house was very weird, and I thought they should have left a porch light on or something. It was also weird that there weren't any cars or anything on the property. I decided to go with him to deliver the pizza. I felt really weird about being alone in this strange place. We walked up to the door. I kept hoping the light would go on at some point, but it didn't. We got up to the door. I also hoped the door would open, but it didn't. My nerves were pretty overpowering. Scott knocked on the door. No one answered, so he knocked on it again. We heard a little bit of movement, followed by some growling. It did not sound like humans growling. Scott knocked on the door again, and it sounded like some sort of distorted barking coming from inside. "This is freaky," I told Scott. I really wanted to get away from this weird place. He knocked again. The growling and weird barking got worse and louder. "I'll try the door," Scott said. I didn't want him to do that. The situation was creepy enough as it was. He tried turning the doorknob and it was unlocked. He opened the door just a little bit, and I began wondering if Scott had ever watched a horror movie before. I mean, this was one of those bizarre horror movie choices. But after getting the door open just a little bit, there was more barking and growling, and then something hit against the door, shutting it very loudly. "I don't know what this is, but I want to get out of here," I suggested. Looking at Scott, I could tell he was just as scared as I was. "Yeah, let's go." We got to the car with the pizza and didn't look back. After talking about it for a while, we figured that there was no one at the house, and some sort of messed up animal inside. Maybe whoever ordered the pizza directed us there, hoping we would get hurt or something. The pizza was not prepaid for, so we had no way of knowing who really ordered it, or what was inside that house. Number 2. So one night I was in the bathroom. I was thinking about stuff, getting lost in my thoughts as usual, until I heard what I thought was a very loud thud. Of course, in that moment I thought it was just my bro being silly, loudly knocking on the door because he had to go, and I was taking too long. We lived in a small, one-bathroom house, so I said, "Almost done." But after I heard 2 more thuds, except I realized it wasn't someone knocking on the bathroom door. It was much louder, and it sounded like a gunshot. Next thing I hear is my family yelling and freaking out. My brother came to the bathroom and told me to lock it and don't open it, so I did. I was terrified. I locked it and grabbed something. I can't remember what it was. It was just a thing I could use to potentially smack anything that tried to come in. So I hid between the sink and the counter. It was a really small bathroom. All I could do was sit there, listening to my family in a panic. But notably, there weren't any more gunshots, or whatever it was that we heard. They of course called the police. At 7:46 a.m., one of the cops got there. I was able to leave the bathroom. The cops suspected that someone threw bombs in our yard. It shattered our front window. Unfortunately for us, that wasn't the end of it. 1 week later, we were in the living room, eating dinner, and we hear some loud bangs in the distance. We jumped to the conclusion that we would hear those loud bangs again, and not long after, we heard a car speeding down the street. And sure enough, a couple more of the loud bangs, scaring us to death. The cops learned that they were throwing M80s into our yard, and while we were glad it wasn't bombs or gunshots, it still scared us. This happened for several weeks. Eventually, one of the cops that lived on our neighborhood was ready, and when they did it again, the cop car was right on them, and they finally caught them. Turned out it was friends of my brother pranking us. Needless to say, my brother wasn't friends with them anymore, after legitimately traumatizing us, making our hearts sink every time we heard a car speeding by. Number 3. Visions of a feline spirit. We've all heard stories about how snakes hypnotize their prey, or how coyotes will trick another much larger predator and steal its kill, or how a cat, whether domestic or wild, will play with its victim, or a grizzly bear's sockeye salmon dance, or the peregrine's plunge, or the reef shark's frenzy. We've all watched rapt in naive fascinations at the abject horror of natural selection, the predator-prey dichotomy, pursuit, fear, exhaustion, resignation, catch, and finally, death. Very few have experienced it directly and lived to tell the tale. When my son, Jay, was very young, I used to take him to this children's zoo where together we would visit the cages and watch the inmates eat, drink, relieve themselves, and otherwise express their anger in a myriad of facial expressions, body language, sign language to each other and us, and we would empathize their captivity. Sometimes if I were in the right place at the right time, we would witness them stalk their prey, or mock the visitors, and rarer still, kill and eat their prey from the protection of their own cages, where most would be forced to live out an artificial existence filled with anger, pain, listlessness, madness, and death. Years later at the San Francisco Zoo, I watched a large sleepy-eyed Bengal tiger napping on a hot summer's day. Every morning he'd take up his position at the corner edge of his cage, seemingly dozing, oblivious to the cares of the world. The AIDS epidemic was just starting, playing the role of the model pet for a sympathetic public. We saw him, often, when we'd visit, but the truth was, he wasn't just dozing, he was actually stalking. At a particular time every morning, a certain mother duck and her brood would walk by, making their rounds from cage to cage. One by one, they trooped past without incident, but this time, the last little duckling, almost at the point of catching up with the group, ended up instead being swept up by the Bengal's massive left paw high into the air, and with the deftness of a crocodile, into the sleeping tiger's massively gaping maw, crushing its soft, cuddly down life up between two sets of cutting and grinding molars at 1,050 pounds per square inch, swallowing the once cute but now grisly glob in one gulp. It only took seconds for the nervous mother to realize that counting her brood over and over again would always and forever come up one short. A few seconds more and she arrived at the inevitable conclusion that she'd best get back and attend to the ones that were still there. Eventually she fled, squinting suspiciously at the massive, still sleeping Bengali, after which she rushed off to take up her duties, collecting, leading, and counting once more, over and over, how many were still in her charge. Once when visiting another zoo, this time in a different state, I inadvertently looked too long into the eyes of a large female tigress, pacing around her cage with two other occupants, a large male and a young male offspring. I hadn't known at the time that they were related. They seemed to be just lounging in the heat, and suddenly the tigress stopped and looked directly into my eyes. It was only for a second, but the effect was like getting hit in the head by a 2x4. The wave of pure malice, the images that came with it, had me almost tripping over my own feet. It hit me with such force I had to practically crawl over to the nearest bench to sit down. The patrons and some zoo employees thought I had suffered a stroke or a heart attack because I could neither walk straight nor answer coherently any questions for some minutes. I didn't try to explain what actually happened, other than to make a lame joke about having partied too much the night before. Afterwards I realized that what I'd experienced was pure, raw, visceral fear. I've never been particularly afraid of cats or any other predators for that matter, but apparently some of the big ones have that power. For the first time in my life, I knew what to expect should I be unlucky enough to meet one up close in the wild. Before I left, I cautiously ventured to look. She was back to pacing her life out again, from one end of the cage to the other. Early on when Cat B and I first met, we used to go to a local zoo, and as always, gravitated to the big cat enclosures. We were standing directly in front of the latest innovation in zoo enclosures, which was known then as the state-of-the-art animal management. It was more or less a cage, surrounded on three sides with molded faux rock, a fake waterfall, some potted shrubbery, and a 5-inch thick sheet of plexiglass for public safety viewing. Another large female tiger, who had been pacing back and forth, suddenly stopped directly in front of me, looked me in the eye, and drew herself up to her full height, about 9 feet, and hit the plexiglass with all of her weight, about 310 pounds. And just before she hit, I found myself all the way back behind the group of people, about 25, that had amassed behind us. Somehow I managed to catapult myself backwards about 10 feet from where we stood only a moment before, and only after did I hear and feel the concussion of the big cat hitting the glass. The tigress had hit the plexiglass so hard, the group, including Cat B, didn't even know that I was no longer in front. After the shock wore off, they looked around to where I'd been and discovered I was all the way in the back. They started laughing and clapping and gave us both a standing ovation. Only afterwards did they realize I was in a semi-state of shock. Looking back, I saw the female once again, pacing back and forth in front of the glass. Finding Cat B, she and I nestled against the shadowed wall, escaping the heat and the light and some of the looks some people gave me. I could barely walk as we clung on to each other, waiting to see if there were any others willing to stand right in front of the pacing female. In the time we were there, no one seemed eager to try. A zoo attendant investigating the hubbub told us that the female had just given birth to 2 cubs, the first time in that zoo's wildlife history. I got my answer as to the why, but I never did get a satisfactory answer as to the how. Years later, this transporting oneself out of the path of danger would occur again. Cat B likened my description of it to how it feels when you're flying in a dream. She was right. I really did feel it in my gut, literally, my stomach. In the time I've known Cat B, she has had the opportunity to witness firsthand some of the unusual situations that have occurred around us. We published a few accounts of them here, together and alone. One such was a dream or vision I had about a Bengal red and white tiger. In the dream I was much younger than I am now, late teens, early 20s, long hair, bell-bottom Levi's, black t-shirt, wide leather belt with a big pewter buckle, biker boots, and old Stetson, what was kind of the look at the times. It was back then when I took a hiatus from school after my first year in college to see a crush and her boyfriend who were living in Tucson at the time. The location in the dream corresponded almost exactly to when I worked at the locally reputed world's largest pecan grove, or so the sign said. It was during the harvest season and I was picking pecans by hand with a large group of migrant workers from around southern and western U.S. and Mexico, and Arizona's incredibly perfect weather, especially during the winter. Some friends came out to see me there because I was living on a site at the times. I camped in the grove rather than stay in the quarters provided for the families. More room for them, I thought. My friends only stayed for a few days, but moments after they left, I had my first encounter with a young cougar. He was apparently hanging out in a large desert willow tree some meters downwind of me. I was in the act of secreting my precious bodily fluids into a dry wash, so the smell must have spooked it. It practically tore the tree and itself apart getting away. Apart from experiencing most thorough total body cleansing I've had since I drank half a bottle of Southern Comfort with a friend in high school, I had a veritable front row seat watching a wild cat, about 8 feet long from nose to tail, with black underbody fur and a gray coat, and not much more than 2 or 3 years of age, get scared, like me, shitless. It was one of the most incredible things. Before I could get my pants back on, I heard and saw it some moments later tear its way across the wash, further upstream on its retreat, or escape, to anywhere but there. In the dream, it was the same time and location some 20 years later, but the cat was a Bengal tiger with a red, orange, black, and white, and it wasn't trying to get away from me. It was stalking me. I remember the fear, the heat, the smell of my own sweat, and myself frantically trying to find something to defend myself with, or some place to climb up high on. Just before it got dark, I found a single long straight tree trunk, with almost no bark, and a completely white trunk, sticking straight out of the ground. I shimmied my way up about 12 feet above the ground, but realized it would probably never work. Tigers love trees. When the Bengal showed up, it just jumped and hit the tree hard with almost enough power to knock me out, which it just about did, or bring the tree and me to the ground. The concussion was so intense, though, I inadvertently called out to the real world. Kathy told me later it sounded like the sound of a wounded animal would make. When the Bengal realized it hadn't worked, it began snarling and pacing around the tree, looking up over and over, trying to get me to look, probably to shock me out. I refused. In the dream, I remember the light beginning to fade and my arms and legs getting tired, trying to hold myself up, but we both knew it was just a matter of time. I tried talking to it, reasoning with it, never letting it fix its eyes on me, but it wasn't having any of it and continued pacing, standing up off and on its hind legs, reaching with one paw or the other to my form, clinging on for dear life, just a few feet away. Time, in the dream, passed and it was night. The sun had just set in the west, but there in the east was a full moon rising. It's what is sometimes called a blood moon, large, red, and swollen. As it continued to rise, the red will fade to a pale pink, and finally a bright white. During some of the moon's phases, the Bengal would turn almost entirely black and become increasingly agitated. I thought it was because it was getting tired and frustrated until I heard a far-off caterwaul somewhere in the east. The Bengal was noticeably spooked and began to display a mixture of both fear and fury. Predictably, it kept looking up at me, trying to draw me into its gaze while, at the same time, faced the challenge of whatever it was that was now pursuing it. When the moon reached its zenith, it was December, the red kept having its attention divided between me and wherever or whatever it was that was out there and getting closer. Finally, all but forgetting about me entirely, together we could just make out what looked to be the largest tiger either of us had ever seen. It was nearly completely white, but with faded black stripes. It looked like a Smeldon I read about in archaeology. This new player had casually, and in hindsight, inevitably, insinuated itself into the drama out here in the dreamscape silhouette of the pecan trees, the rocks, the berms, washes, cactus, etc. And though it somehow belonged there too, it kept smelling the ground, sniffing the air, at first in the direction of the moon, and later seeming to appear and then disappear in every direction. At first it appeared as a kind of sentient white smudge of light, drifting on an uncertain breeze, and then as a 12-foot, 650-pound pale white and black menace, fading in and out, contrasting with the stark white moon and the ink-black landscape. The only two bearing any semblance to living creatures were me and the Bengal, now oblivious to each other, and riveted to the slow-approaching white, ambling along ever closer. The red of the blood moon, a fading memory, or was it a portent? I nearly forgot my own plight when I saw it appear solid for the first time. It was about 20 feet away from my tree of belated death when it approached the Bengal below. At first it showed a kind of curiosity, not threatening, just curious, circling slowly from right to left, leaning in to smell the other scent, face to face and then end to end, only to lope away almost playfully. This was repeated over and over, and always instigated by the white. When the white finally changed its pattern, veering suddenly to the left, I genuinely feared for the much smaller and inexperienced red. I shared its panic when the white lunged and tore its right flank with this massive outstretched paw, grazing its left rear side. When the white finally changed its pattern, veering suddenly to the left, I genuinely feared for the much smaller and inexperienced red. I shared its panic when the white lunged and tore its right flank with its massive, outstretched paw, glazing its left rear side with skin and blood. The red roared in pain and dismay and battered the air, but there was nothing there, because the white, now behind the red, raised itself up on its hind legs and came down so hard that it knocked the wind out of the red, who only just managed to pull itself away with two lifeless legs and a broken pelvis. I knew because I felt the white hot searing pain myself, and nearly lost my grip on the tree I was clinging to. I watched and felt with horror, revulsion, and sympathy how the white took its advantage, battering the red with strike upon strike, even as the red, still defiant, roared out its pain. I wept as the white struck out one last time and broke its neck, and the red was finally still. I cried, sickened by the smell and the sound, clinging on to dear life, as the white began eviscerating it, breaking its bones, licking its blood, and eating its offal, not 12 feet below me. I watched quaking at the realization that it could have been me, and then finally that it was me. I saw and felt the sensations of what it would be like to be eaten alive, what it smelled like, what it looked like, but I was still alive. And the whole time the white never looked up, not even after finishing its gory, cannibalistic repast, but instead lay down to sleep. As it slept, I saw myself, my old self, or what was left of it, fade, like the white tiger stripes into the dying light of the blood moon, and replaced by what I took to be my new, or actual self, and it was pure white. I slid quietly down the tree I had spent the last who knows how many days or weeks or years in, hiding from everything, even myself. I knew what or who it was that was devoured before my own eyes. I knew who or what did it, and I was glad. Now on the ground with the setting moon in the west, at my back, and the dawning in the east, I looked long and deep into the eyes of the enormous, now fully awake white tiger, and knew I no longer had anything to fear of myself or the world. Somehow, that had been proven to me. Sometimes I would still look back at the memory of my remains, and weep again for a life lost, and a time gone, and realize all over again that I was finally free of all that led up to who I was then, and revealed who I am now. I woke up to find Cat B lying awake beside me, as she would when I'd had another rough night or a nightmare and told her all about it. She intoned only one word: meow. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.